God, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Remember when I graduated from college, my father came up to me about a day after I graduated. He handed me an envelope and he said, "This is your insurance bill, your car, your life insurance, and everything else." And I thought, well, okay, that's kind of strange, but I understand what you're trying to say. It was odd for me because not only he was my father, he was also my insurance agent. So I went from being a son to being a customer in about 20 minutes. But I knew what he was trying to say. It's, you're on your own now. Time to grow up, time to pay your own bills. You can do that. So when you look back over the course of your life, when was it that you all really understood it's time to grow up? Maybe it was time when you finally graduated from college, or you joined the military, or maybe you had a child and you realized for the first time in your life, the universe doesn't really revolve around you. It revolves around somebody else. Or you grew up when you realized somebody close to you, the first person close to you that died, and what it did and how devastating that was. Or the fact that you failed epically for the first time in your life, and you had to grow up, you had to pick yourself up off the ground, you had to do some things you didn't know you were capable of doing. It's the realization, I think, when you grow up, when you can't fix every single problem, or maybe now that you're on your own, maybe you've grown up to the idea that I can't do it on my own. I actually need other people, depend upon other people. Whatever that is, there's just seminal moments in our life when we grow up. So traditionally, we look at the marks of adulthood, from going from a child to an infant to a teenager to adulthood. There's really about 5 things historically we've kind of agreed upon. One is finish your education. Second is leave home. Third, find work or find employment. Fourth is get married. And the fifth is have children. So if you do those things, and it's not the track for everybody, but typically that's traditionally how we looked at you entering into adulthood. Do you realize in 2023, every single one of those benchmarks has been delayed or deferred by a younger generation? I mean, every single one of them. In fact, you're finishing education later and later. I mean, it's a staggering figure that shows that about 14% of people and undergraduates are going to finish their degree in about 6 years. It means it just takes longer. They're delaying it. The idea of even leaving home, that 47% of people who are 18 to 29 are still living at home. You know people like this. You might be people like this that are still having your kids live with you at home. It's becoming more and more typical. Those things are getting delayed. People in that generation are finding work later, or finding the kind of work that they want to do much, much later. They're getting married later. They're delaying it into their early 30s. They're deciding to have children later, if they decide to have children at all. So every generation changes, but this generation in particular, the one that's coming up, is beginning to delay those things. And if you just look at it and you say on the surface, well, it's because they're lazy and uncommitted, unfocused, think again. You're in a different world than they are. It's a hard world economically. I mean, there was a whole generation that sort of started out slowly, and they could buy starter homes, they could pay for their education, and they started out. It's no longer that world. You look at starter homes, you look at the cost of education, you look at the cost of raising kids, it's just almost insurmountable. So all these things that you sort of look at as the benchmarks of maturity, we begin to talk about how hard it is to grow up and what it took for a lot of us to grow up. And typically males grow up slower than females. You shouldn't be surprised at that. So we're talking about this letter today that we might need to write to ourselves, in particular to our younger self. If we could transport ourselves, go back in time and take a look at our younger self, what would we say? What would we need to hear at that age? What do we wish people would have said to us when we had to deal with things that we weren't quite prepared for? So there's an old song, it's by Rod Stewart, it's called Ooh La La. There's a line that says, I wish that I knew what I know now when I was younger. I don't think it's in the hymnal, but it's a great line. And so we wish that we knew some things right back then that we know now, but we don't. So you go back and you realize over the course of anybody's life, it's a series of bad choices. You've made some improper decisions and unfortunate circumstances and unwelcome changes, all those things that happen to you, and you sort of begin to navigate life as best you can, but you just don't have everything, and you realize there's no shortcuts to maturity. There's no easy paths. It's hard because most of us learn the hard way. So when Paul writes this, it's pretty personal, because he's reflecting on his own past. He's looking back over the course of his life and he's admitting, There was a time when I thought I knew everything, and now I realize I didn't. Not only I didn't know, I was wrong. I was wrong about this little movement called the people of the way, the followers of Christ. I thought they were heretical. I thought they were threatening everything I held sacred. I was wrong about Jesus. I was wrong about other people. I was wrong about God. I was wrong about everything. And he begins to put things in perspective, and it takes a blinding light on the road to Damascus to finally open his eyes and begin to see, and he grows up and he matures, and it's the moment he finds Jesus, or more accurately, Jesus finds him, and at some point, all of us are going to hear this voice inside of our heads. It's time to grow up. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became an adult, I put away such childish things. Dan Kiley wrote a book a number of years ago called The Peter Pan Syndrome. If you haven't read it, it's called Men Who Have Never Grown Up. And he talks about some segment of population in particular of young males who just don't grow up. They just seemingly are in perpetual adolescence. They don't do their work at home. They don't seek employment. They don't get married. They don't have commitments. They just sort of failure to launch and do things on their own, take responsibility, take care of all the things financially that they need to. And to realize there's just something about some segment of our population that just doesn't want to grow up. I saw an article that talked about violence in America, and I think it was spot on. It said the most dangerous person in America is an isolated, angry male under the age of 35 who is broke, socially isolated, and completely alone. There's this sense of people wanting to grow up. The average age of a video gamer is 32 years old. At some point, you wonder how they're going to grow up. I remember watching an argument between two people, and I just stepped back and I was listening. I thought, it's the silliest, most ridiculous argument. They were acting like it was life and death, and I thought to myself, is there going to be an adult in the room? Is anybody going to assume the role of an adult? Or are you just going to have this childish argument? Because we live in this immature world, and you have to deal with people, and you deal with them, I deal with them. There are people who literally will say anything, do anything without any regard to how it impacts anybody else around them. I mean, how many videos do you and I have to watch about people getting kicked off an airplane because they will not follow simple protocol, etiquette, and rules? Or people who are self-centered and selfish, people who blame others for everything, become a victim, who will never accept responsibility for anything they did, but blame everything for everything they've done. I don't know about you. I can only think about a handful of times when I look at somebody who's been in an argument to say, you're 100% right or 100% wrong. Usually there's some responsibility on each side, whether it's 70-30 or 50-50. You can't just say, well, one person's completely the problem and the other person has no problem in it at all. Or people who lack commitment to do anything beyond what they just want to do. Or those who are just irresponsible. They can't handle just the responsibilities of day-to-day living. And what Paul says, what we all say is we need to grow up. It's time to grow up. We need more spiritually mature people. We actually need more spiritually mature churches. So Paul's dealing with churches that are in infancy, and he uses all the analogy. I try to give you solid food, but you're almost like babies, and I have to give and just sort of feed you just until you grow up, until you understand a little bit more. And he writes this, as a result, we aren't supposed to be infants any longer who can be tossed and blown around by every wind that comes from teaching with deceitful scheming and the tricks people play to deliberately mislead others. Instead, by speaking the truth with love, let's grow in every way into Christ who is the head. You know, when you look back over the course of your life, maybe you ought to admit that some of the things that happened to you, honestly, you just weren't ready. You really weren't at the stage of your life where you're ready to accept it, to believe it, to bear it, to deal with it, to even later on fully appreciate it. Because it takes time. It takes maturity, and you don't get there overnight. It happens, and the problem is we learn the hard way, and if you're wise at this stage of your life, you probably have the scars to show it because you didn't get there easily. Nobody hands you this easy lesson. You learn the hard way. This guy named Scott Galloway, who's a professor at NYU, and he's written all research on happiness, and I thought he said something interesting. He said, you know, your childhood and teenage years, even your college years, you just think you're invincible. There's nothing that's going to happen to you. The whole world is before you. You've got all the possibilities of the world. You just feel like anything that you ever want to do in life, you can do, and everything is open up to you, and you live like that. And then in your late 20s and 30s, some of you are there. Boy, life just gets real, is what he says. You suddenly have to figure out how to pay all your bills and where you're going to live and how you're going to juggle jobs and what you're going to make. And they're hard choices, and you have to make them. Nobody makes them for you. And you begin to sort of realize that you're not a kid anymore. And then when you get into your 30s, you start to realize some of your ultimate dreams may not pan out. It may not be, you actually may not be the senator from your own state, or you may not name a perfume after you. You just sort of begin to realize that things are finite, that there's going to be some limitations on where you go, what you do in your life. You begin to experience it and accept it. Sometimes it's disappointing. But he said, wait, things get better in your 40s and 50s. And you begin to sort of appreciate, and you begin to have an awareness, and you have some introspection. You begin to look at life, and you begin to say, there are things that make me grateful. Yeah, I've lived with some disappointments. You begin to sort of have a better peace. You become comfortable in your own skin, and you no longer worry about what everybody else thinks about you to the degree that it affected you like it once did. And you just sort of have a peace about you inside and life in general. And then he says, the happiest generation of people, well, the generation that shouldn't be happy. People over their age of 60. Because they've just come to terms with life, and they know when to let go and how to hold on. And even in spite of all the challenges with an older age, these are the people who are actually happier than anybody, because they're just grateful in general for life, and they let things happen, and they just don't let them and take them for granted. So it takes time and an evolution for maturity to happen. When Paul happens, he sort of mirrors that. And so what he does in one passage, he'll tell you everything that he ever did in his life, and he counts his credibility, his resume, and it's impressive. And he said, I did all this. I was the best of the best. I accomplished the greatest heights of everything. I was well respected, well known. I had all the power, all authority. I got to do everything I ever thought, hoped, and dreamed I could do. And then what he says, but whatever gain I had, I counted as a loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. Go back into that passage. He cleans up that version. He just looks at his life and thinks all the stuff I used to think were important, just trash. Doesn't mean a thing. The only thing that really means anything to me now is Jesus. And that's for the rest of my life going to be my main priority. It takes him a lifetime. It takes most of us a lifetime to realize that we've been wrong about so many things. Paul realizes that he put his ladder against the wall thinking it would lead him to success, only to realize late in life it was the wrong wall. It didn't lead to success. It just led to more emptiness. That he has to go through everything, the good and the bad and the ugly, to finally figure out that the only thing that really matters for him is Jesus. So wisdom is this hard-earned, painful gift. And at this stage of your life, if you are wise, it's because it's come at a cost to you, and you've learned the hard way. And if you wrote a letter to yourself, your younger self, I hope you know there's a kid who needs to listen to you, and if you don't catch this, that kid is still very much inside of you, even though there are some years that distance yourself. So what would you write to your younger self? That's up to you. What if you took out or sat at your computer and just began to write at a particular age when you were 8, 9, 15, whatever it might be, and you just began to write saying what you know now, what you want them to know? What would it be? One, I would say, sit down and say, whether you know it or not, everything is going to be okay. You may not feel that way. In the middle of it, you feel like your world's falling apart. You feel like there is no future, there is no hope. But let me tell you, it does work out. It's not the end of anything. I would also tell them life goes fast. Don't believe everything that you hear, which is what we do when we're younger. Spend less time worrying about what everybody else thinks about you or how popular you think you need to be, because friends are important. But at some point you'll know the difference between real friends and those that are not real friends. And it's a hard lesson. And maybe you'll write that the best thing you could do at your age, once you begin to sort of dwell on all of your problems and thinking about how terrible things are, is get up and go help somebody else. Go befriend somebody who's lonely. Sit at their table if they're by themselves. If somebody's hungry, go feed them. It's the best thing you do. It's what Jesus says. If you want to find your life, you lose your life. You give it away in love and service, which is the opposite of what we do. We just keep thinking about all the things that we need, want, and that we're missing. Get up, help somebody, and it all begins to put things in perspective. The other thing we might say to our younger self is everything you're experiencing now is actually going to come back later. And you're going to be able to use it and build upon it and learn from it and grow through it. Stop comparing yourself to everyone else, which we finally, I hope, end up doing, but it's a hard lesson. Money is not everything. I think we ought to write to ourselves, don't be too hard on yourself, because we all make mistakes, we all stumble. It's called grace. It's the only way we ever grow in this world. I would also listen more to people who actually know more than I did, older people that you don't dismiss who really do understand the wisdom of life. I would also write to a younger self, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Err on the side of grace. Be like God, slow to anger, quick to forgive, abounding in steadfast love. That God is very real. He's at work in you, and even when you don't know it, you can feel the presence of God and see His fingerprints at work everywhere. That if you put your whole trust in God, even at an early age, God will order your steps and lead you to the places that you need to be as well. Do you know spiritual maturity, whether it's a church or whether it's you, is not about age, because I've seen people who are incredibly mature at a very young age and people who are immature at an older age. Has nothing to do with age, doesn't have to do with achievements, what Paul's telling you. Just because you've accomplished more doesn't mean you know more. It's not about age, not about achievements, also not about appearances. It's not about trying to convince other people how wise you are. Wisdom comes from within. It exudes. You can't just make it an appearance or try to convince other people otherwise. So what Paul's saying when he says, I used to be a child, now I've grown up, what he's saying is grow up. It's time, and time to grow up well. So here's a confession. We tell our kids, and this is what we do, because I know, I've done it before. We tell our kids, just be yourself. Just be the best version of you that you could possibly be. Just follow your own passions, your own dreams, pursue whatever it is in life that you want. Just be you. That's all we can ask. You know why I know that's true? Because I've said that, and I believed it. But I think in the church we have something to offer, that there's a better model of how to live and how to love, and it's called Jesus. So the older I've gotten, the wiser I've become. It finally begins to dawn on me. I want to be less like me and a whole lot more like Him.